question on my mind on this tour is, how's Montana view the national scene after the last couple tumultuous years? And I realize that you have your own point of view, but you and Jackie are very much into the community here. So you can speak, I think, with some authority about how other people feel. So I'd be interested in your own personal view and then what you see in the community.
Well, I think what we're seeing is the national split, which I do this seminar for Leadership Bitterroot, which is, of course, under Leadership Montana and there's Leadership Washington, kind of a Chamber of Commerce assembly of bringing in young professionals, and they spend a year with a day once a month where they go to various offices and enterprises and so on and get involved. The seminar I give starts with talking about the history of Montana, but I preface that with going back to the time of the Vikings. And I do that because in Iceland, for instance, they still have the equivalent of what we call a town meeting. And the Vikings, rather than bowing to nobility all that much, they had kings and so on like that, but every farmer figured he was as good. My sword is as good as the king's. If he wants to collect taxes for me, he can come and fight me. If he wins, I'll give him his damn money. Well, anyway, that of course landed in England with the raids of the Vikings and then the Battle of Hastings. And I bring that up to this group because I said in 1066 that split really started. And what you had then were the Normans, who became sort of the elites, landed here as Washington, Jefferson, the plantation owners. And you had the Scots-Irish, who are the people of Appalachia and the Ozarks and so on like that. And a lot of them came to Montana during and after the Civil War because here there's still kind of a Confederate background. I always call the Bitterroot Valley a Missouri Valley. Until the advent of all the people coming from California and other places, it was kind of that way. It was fairly heavy Scots-Irish here as opposed to Irish in Butte, straight Irish, and Scandinavians and to the north and the east.
You know, Allan, you may not have realized that my cousin was up here in 1865.
Yeah, and part of that same group.
And he wasn't Irish, and he wasn't, he was English.
Yeah.
But maybe that's why people trusted him more than the others.
Yeah.
Because when he left, in 69, he took $3,000 worth of gold nuggets and powder that other families had trusted him to take back to Missouri.
Yeah.
And southern Illinois, where he came from.
Yeah.
But it was only a temporary trip. He liked it so much, he found a bride and got his brother, and they came back, just about 15 years later.
I'll be darned.
And settled up here.
And of course, in this valley, the Chaffins and the Slacks were the first ones here, and they were escaping the barn burnings and the irregular Confederate raids and Bleeding Kansas and the Coffeyville massacres and all that sort of thing.
But what's that have to do with the current scene?
Because it still kind of hangs over that big government is bad and that everything should be local. And Montana's funny in the sense that if you look at Republican versus Democrat, and there's a few socialists and there were even communists in there, but not to amount to much. But if you remember, at the 100th year of statehood, somebody had put together a list of all offices from the time of the Civil War up till that time, and which party, and it was like 49%. And that's why we have a Democrat governor and one senator, and then Republicans elsewhere, because they are so near that tipping point back and forth. This county tends to be more 40-60, and of course Missoula probably be 60-40 if you were to do it that way. And I think Missoula partially because of the university and so on. One big effect here, I was telling Sasha, of course, when I do this program, I say, well, when Teddy Roosevelt ran in '04, and in '12 he won a plurality in Ravalli County. Now he didn't for the state, and of course he didn't win nationally, but he was strong here. And then by '24, as the Depression began to appear on the horizon, Robert La Follette, the socialist from Wisconsin, won the plurality in this county. So this county has switched back and forth. It voted for Roosevelt 2 or possibly 3 times, and then since then has been predominantly Republican, sometimes at that 60-40% kind of thing. So there are still quite a few Democrats, but it's reached the point here where almost nobody even bothers to try to run as a Democrat because it's useless.
Jeanette Rankin, did she carry this county both times?
I think she did, yeah.
I don't know that.
Yeah, I'd have to go look that up because I haven't looked at that
I
personally.
mean, she was Republican.
Yeah.
She was a socially oriented Republican with
Yeah.
other issues on her mind, including women's franchise.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how Ravalli County would have viewed that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's available and you could look it up. But
does that enter into thinking today? Is there anybody in the county who remembers Jeanette Rankin, how important she was?
some of the, well, if you are around the library, around a couple of the study groups, oh yes, they remember. They also remember J. Wellington Rankin and the guy who used prisoners as slave labor.
That's
and
right.
that sort of thing. So that kind of cuts into that just a little bit.
I had personal experience with Wellington Rankin's I worked for a guy over in Helena who had connections with him.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't
Yeah.
meet him. But at any rate, the view of the national scene, is there a sense any different now than there was 5 years ago?
I think that the effect of the election last fall, because people who were Republican, of course, were voting for Trump, not with great enthusiasm, and there were, again, probably about 40% voted for Hillary, and then I could say a bunch of us really weren't enamored of either one and went third party. And I think...
This is for Johnson, the Libertarian?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that we'll see a little more of that. Not that that will probably, in this country, have much effect, but seeing Canada and Great Britain, where a third party gets large enough in the 10-15%, where if it swings from one to the other, it can create a majority for Labour or for Conservatives. And
but this time, I assume, in your mind, it was a protest vote, not a vote for the winner. You didn't expect Johnson to win.
a lot of it was people saying, well, I'm sick of all the things that are going on. Ironically, looking at budgets, and of course the budget still has to go through Congress, so it's not going to be the way it's presented by administration. But that if you want to call us rednecks or hillbillies or whatever, that in fact the programs which are being cut are impacting worse than the people who voted for Trump. And I think I sense disappointment. Even veterans, and of course I sit around with a lot of veterans, and veterans and many retired policemen and firemen that come here from California. That changed to a very solid Republican, almost very radical Republican attitude here, and they don't know what to think because they see things that are important to them. I remind some of my coffee buddies that I said, better not get too hard on the government. Every last one of us lives off a dole of a retirement check every month that comes from Uncle Sam, so don't criticize them too hard.
Well, that's what you say. But what do others say who receive that, who have never thought of themselves as socialist or as dependent on they just feel they're entitled?
That's it. They figure they're entitled, and heaven knows they probably are. But they don't see themselves as in a socialist kind of a position.
So if they lose out on entitlements, for example, health care, do you think that'll change their feelings?
Oh, I think unless something gets settled, right now it's an uproar. Doctors and health workers are just up in the air, not knowing what on earth is happening and where it's going to go, because it'll affect them very directly. And
Do you think that's the key issue in attitudes about central government right now and around here? If that goes sour?
Yeah. If the, for instance, if Obamacare, which has benefited some people here, and Medicaid, if that goes down, then it leaves people in a position of, and there have been a number of people here which are not covered by any kind of program, and through nonprofits and volunteers and so on, they've developed a clinic, for instance, in Hamilton, and also do some in Darby, which allows people who don't have the money to get in and get taken care of. Otherwise, what they're doing is that they're waiting until it becomes emergency room time, which is expensive and maybe a little late for some of them.
Do you think many of those, you started out talking about the heritage, the cultural heritage out of Scandinavia, do you think they'll fall back on that ethic and say, well, you could never trust government anyway, and besides, all of us should make our own way, so if you die because you're not getting health care from the government, that's nature, and that's the way it ought to be?
I think it'll stop kind of short of that because this is a heavily church-going county, and at some point the churches do a number of things. Our church, for instance, feeds kids all summer because that program doesn't exist out of the school year. And there are other things like we have a homeless problem in this county, primarily single women with kids who couch surf from auntie to grandma and so on, back and forth, not like homeless under the bridge in Missoula. And my cousins, when they're visiting from Norway, said, how is it possible to be homeless? In Norway, for instance, that last sweep at 11 o'clock at night, if there's somebody drunk or a drug addict or a refugee that somehow slipped in, they are policed up and brought into a shelter, and then by next morning a social worker is trying to get them straightened out. And of course, what I try to explain again to people talking about so-called socialism, Scandinavia, the reason why Norway, Sweden, and Denmark compete to be the happiest countries on earth is because there is a safety net through which you cannot fall. Nothing can happen to you, either sickness or age or disability or anything else means that you're going to be out on the street or can't live a decent and dignified life. And they can do it. They're small countries, and Norway has oil, and sure, it makes it a lot easier. But they do watch each other much more carefully, and then being pretty much one ethnic origin, they've done this for 1,000 years, so it makes it easier.
Let me turn this from the central government and attitude about what's going to happen if, in fact, things do fall apart, and look inside the state, the legislature, and actually your county commissioners. Do you find a perception generally if it's a Republican-dominated legislature, and the county commissioners, I assume, are Republican?
Yeah, they all are.
Do you think anything, well, two questions. One, do they feel quite different than the national politicians? Do they feel their job is really different? Or are they defending, and therefore they're defending the old ways of Montana? Or do you think that they are likely to get very upset and want to have some sort of general national change in order to cope with the problems that will come if there's a really continued negative downturn?
Well, they kind of lobby back and forth. An example would be the PILT, the payment in lieu of taxes for the Forest Service. That was almost shut off, and then all of a sudden the county commissioners are overjoyed to realize that last week or the week before, 2.1 million is coming to this county to make up for the Forest Service taxes which are not paid. Since 70% of this county is federal land, of course, otherwise there'd be no taxes, although the county still, there's firefighting and there's road building that affects them, even if it's up onto the public lands. And so there's a tendency for the counties to depend very heavily on federal money. Some of it comes through state, as with our RC&D hazardous fuel program. That's Forest Service money comes to State Department of Natural Resources, and then it comes down here for people to assist them in cleaning up around their homes, which last summer saved 14 homes in that terrible Roaring Lion fire. And we keep working on that trend. If you're going to live in the woods, for gosh sakes, at least make yourself safe, and we'll help you. And people are perfectly happy to do that. And of course, remembering too, this county, if you count pensions, federal benefits, outside income like dividends and interest paid and so on like that, that's about 60% of the income in this county. Only about 30% of this county's income is earned income from profits from business or from working wages. So we are on the dole by about 2/3 in this county.
Even though my question was about what's going on inside the state, you end up giving an answer, well, it depends on the feds.
Yeah,
And
it goes back to that.
But coming back, I would like to pursue Helena and the state legislature and Hamilton and the county legislature. Is there a capacity to solve problems? Do people expect Helena and the county commissioners to solve a lot of their problems? Or
Pretty heavily, the main ones would be things like, the road department is important. Schools are important. The schools were badly cut in their budgets this last go-around, to the point that individual contributors are, well, like right next to it is Charles Schwab's Stock Farm Club just over the fence here, and
would you describe that just a little bit?
Yeah. What it was the old stock farm. Marcus Daly, of course, had his wife actually built the mansion, which is down near the town, and which is now a historical
And he
place.
was one of the titans, the
Yeah,
kings of
he was the Copper King.
Copper King.
Yeah, and the ranch was about 30,000 acres, something like that. And then when Margit Besnier, his granddaughter, died, she was married a Hungarian count. Then it went to the family, and the daughters are still here, and a lot of the land got sold, but part of it right next to us was sold to Charles Schwab, and they've developed, I think there's almost 200 homes on that. You can't see them. I mean, they're just nicely tucked away, each at about $1 million or more, and then a huge golf club. And took out my elk hunting grounds, but be that as it may, the elk are still there, and they put new holes and divots all over the golf course. So, but at any rate, those people have had some influence here. They are pretty generous. They've contributed toward the schools. I'm on the board of Teller Wildlife Refuge. They've been very generous with helping us maintain that. And we had, just to show you, the budgets for Corvallis School were cut back to the point where they wouldn't be able to take kids out to teach conservation out on the refuges, and had to have research for the older students and do things like that. And so what we did was we set up a program called Fund the Need. And at the T&T where some of the people, a lot of people came from Missoula, but it was a fundraiser, about 150 people. And the auctioneer said, okay, who will give $25,000 toward making sure that buses can run and people can be paid to take the kids out and do these things which the school board now can't fund anymore. And he got down to 15, nobody. At 12, a hand went up, and then the dam broke. At 10, another hand. At 5,000, 2 hands went up, and because it got down to me, I put up 100 anyway. They raised $53,000 to give to the schools to make sure the kids have an opportunity to go out and experience and do conservation on the land.
Was that an unusual experience? Or
No, this started a few years ago on a more modest scale, and primarily to cover costs at the refuge. Now it's to try to help the schools out in their hour of need.
So it's kind of annual.
Yeah, this will go on, and especially with schools being, so strapped for funds.
Okay, looking around the state, would you expect other counties to have this kind of function going on?
It can happen, I suppose. One of the things that happened in the legislature, and I serve on the Economic Development Authority with a guy who's one of our representatives in the legislature, fairly moderate Republican, and I asked him, why on earth did you get in this tiff where the Democrats had several projects, including adding to the museum or building it, doing some renovation on the MSU campus, and a bunch of other things, which would be done with bond funds, with bonds at 1.5%. What a bargain to be able to bond. And at the same time, eastern Montana, they were affected by the oil fields, of course, towns that needed sewer and water help and so on like that. And again, bonding. And the Republican side decided that no, we're going to spend what we can out of our current budget, which meant none of those were funded, and we'll just leave it that way. And even this guy said, we do bonds for everything else because it's pretty cheap and you pay it back with cheaper money as time goes on. But they got in a tiff with each other and the two sides couldn't agree, so the Democrats canceled what the Republicans want, and the Republicans canceled what the Democrats want, and so the legislature walked away without doing very much.
These problems are getting worse.
Yeah.
Because the tax base is eroding, and the cost of doing things is escalating.
Yeah. And the thing was, as you know, I was back in February, I was back in Washington and made 14 Senate office visits. And luckily, they were in recess, so the senators weren't there. Therefore, the lobbyists weren't there. Therefore, the staff was there in their old sweaters and their blue jeans and had lots of time.
Right.
And we had several different things. One was for National Center for Appropriate Technology out of Butte, especially the ag program, which touts organic and sustainable agriculture and covers what a lot of stuff which Extension doesn't have the money to do anymore, and a veterans program for troubled veterans to get them back onto the farm and get them producing high quality crops. So that is one, and Job Corps, and for other things like that. But the split back there, and I've been going back to D.C. for 50 years, and the split and the kind of the harshness of the feelings from one side to the other are stronger than I've ever seen before.
Yeah, I want to stick inside the state about the state culture.
Yeah.
Do you think this split that paralyzed Helena in the last legislative session is a reflection of that national thing, or is it something fundamental?
There's some of it there. The municipalities, the larger towns, you could say the 5 or 7 larger towns in Montana, probably tend to be in that direction, and the rural areas less so. And of course, the rural areas are suffering right now. Drought in the east, which has ruined a lot of crop possibilities and has really gotten bad. This has caused a big sell-off in cattle, and cattle prices were down anyway. Now they're really down. Wheat, there's a world surplus of wheat. We're knee-deep in it. And so agriculture is suffering. Coal doesn't know what's going to happen. Coal strip, of course, they talk about...
Do you think most people, majority of Montanans would favor Trump's effort to reinvigorate coal?
I think they're watching it with interest, but everybody, of course, understands that natural gas is out competing it. And there's some understanding of the CO2 problem and that sort of thing, although the methane from other fossil fuel resources is much worse and nobody pays much attention to that. They're still here. If you start talking about global warming, you get a smirk for a while and then finally arguments defending the energy companies.
So you think that's a majority position?
Well, I don't know if it's a majority. I think the majority probably stays silent on it. But there's certainly a substantial, I'd say most of the people in this county who vote Republican have no assurance that there's any global warming, and they believe it's a hoax like Trump does.
Okay.
So it's very hard to talk about that. And of course, in NCAT, we're doing the opposite. We're trying to
Would you
help.
explain briefly?
The National Center for Appropriate Technology is set up by Mike Mansfield in Butte about 40 years ago, or more than 40 years ago, and is based kind of on Schumacher's Small is Beautiful thing. The idea was to help people understand other methods of energy production, solar, wind, geothermal, and all that sort of thing, and at the same time and at that time with nozzle heads, as we called them, in the ag campus, who believed in spraying and praying. The idea of going organic or doing old-fashioned things like rotations and stuff like that was kind of odd. Well, we formed the program then that kind of works toward helping people do organic production, or at least sustainable production. So those are the two main programs of NCAT. And
Which is a national
national
orientation.
program.
Montana is incidental.
The headquarters is in Butte, and we have 7 other places, and something over 120 specialists doing energy and agriculture advice.
7 other places in Montana?
No, one Davis, down San Antonio, up on the East Coast, down in Mississippi.
So around the United States. Okay.
In fact, our crew at Davis, there's 7 people there. They 5 of them are fluent in Spanish.
So does Montana have legislature or governors have any particular connection with NCAT?
Not really. They come and visit once in a while, and they're aware of what we do. And when we opened a new program at Butte, the governor came, and the congressman at the time came.
And the county commissioners in Silver Bowl County, where Butte is, don't have any benefit from
they get, they're aware of it. One of the programs which we did a long time ago is put solar panels on every firehouse in Montana, which means if the electricity fails, the batteries in the trucks and the radios will still be charged. Then the schools in Butte, quite a few of the schools in Butte have solar panels.
And that's because of NCAT, basically.
Yeah, because of NCAT's work. So there are things going on like this, and another group called AERO, Alternative Energy Resources Organization, which is John Tester and I were on the board of that many years ago. And that one is the one that has kind of changed the face of agriculture a little bit, with people looking at oil seeds like safflower and canola, and the lentils, the growing of pulses, which has become important, especially on the dryland areas. As they get drier, of course, garbanzos and lentils and so on, they're from the Middle East, they can grow in that stuff, and it's become quite a market. And then, of course, you know about the development of kamut, the ancient Egyptian wheat, which was brought out of retirement 3,000 years old and got started again. That's quite a market. So Montana works toward these specialty markets. But one of the interesting things, and it's sort of an aside, but stop and think, in 1880s, there were something like 250 different, small admittedly, but facilities to process. There were 50 creameries in Montana. There were 20 canneries. There were about 50 slaughterhouses. There were 50 flour mills. There were 40 breweries. By 1980s, there was one flour mill left in Great Falls. There were no breweries. The canneries were gone. The only slaughterhouses were the little country slaughterhouses. And we're getting microbreweries back and a little bit of milling and whatnot like that. But there's no feed yards.
You know, those statistics you just cited couldn't be argued. Means that Montana is simply part of the national economy, and that our culture, it's a myth that there's a Montana culture.
Yeah. This was a North Vietnamese. And this one I found in a bunker when I was stationed in Germany. This one is a Russian one when I was in Kazakhstan. That's what they used in Afghanistan. Here, I'll switch on these. Really?
Oh, that's right. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Like, you have a flag there.
Well, I can protect you from the sun, but it's not going to keep many bullets away.
No. And this one is one I found an engraved in Norway, in North Norway. And you see why it was on a grave. This one.
Was that a Norwegian army or?
No, that was German. And they were, of course, the Norwegians were coming back in from Sweden, and the Russians were coming from their side. And of course, the Germans had burned all of Finnmark, which was about the size of Oregon and Washington. Burned every house in Finnmark, just destroyed.
1944.
Yeah, just as the war was ending. This I got in Kazakhstan. I got a whole bunch of those. This guy had these left over. This was after the fall of communism. They came out, and I got a bunch, 8 or 10 of them for $20. And that's what's happened. And
Is there much awareness of that? Do you
oh
think?
yeah, people are aware of it, and they've tried, on a small scale to do small value-added enterprises. There's one poultry butchering facility in Montana, and that's right here at Hamilton. Now the Hutterites, of course, have their own, but you can't go in.
Do you know how many Hutterite settlements there are?
There's at least 50 now, and they're growing.
The average one would have how many people in it?
Oh, 200 to 300 up.
So 50 settlements and 200 to 300 people in
Yeah.
the average.
I say 100 years from now, Hutterites may be the only farmers left in Montana because they raise their own help. And they like to buy at least 10,000 acres at a time. And so they're spreading because they're very efficient. They use modern methods. The Amish are otherwise, and they have their own system. And the Mennonites are kind of in between.
As you described that, it suggests a potential for great political power. At the present time, do the Hutterites have any political power at all?
They don't get much. I think they vote, and being German, they would almost entirely vote Republican.
But they're not active. They don't have lobbyists in Helena.
No.
Yeah.
If there's certain things come up, whether it's things like irrigation problems or something to do with land management or so on like that, they will appear at the legislature and quietly talk to act as lobbyists. But for the most part, they just operate on their own. For instance, they raise most of the hogs in Montana now, but those go to Canada to be slaughtered. And they produce a lot of vegetables and fruits, and that is kind of bringing back, I was telling Sasha that in the old days, of course, Serbians and Bulgarians came here to be stonemasons during the courthouse building days and the public building days. While after that ended, getting into the 30s, they became vegetable farmers. And so there were Bulgarians here until they finally died out, after the Second World War, that were great producers of fruit. Now this valley once had almost 100,000 acres of apples, and now we're down to 120, I suppose.
As we were coming up, we passed Pinesdale. So I was describing to Sasha the nature of Pinesdale. Do you think the Mormon community, whether it be a Jack Mormon or regular Mormon, has a parallel influence in any way to the Hutterites?
Yeah, pretty strong in the sense that Mormons will almost always vote Republican. In Utah, those who vote Democrat are the leftover Italians and Irishmen and whatnot, I suppose. But the polygamous colony here is kind of interesting. They were broken up in 1953 when they were discovered, and they had been in a big fight with the Jeffs, the guys who was now in jail, of course. And the army scattered the old folks down to the old Japanese internment camps in Arizona for a while and then allowed them to come back. The young people, who are our age now, were sent, and Utah didn't want them, Idaho didn't want them. They came up to Montana. Montana didn't care. Live the way you want to. And so the Apostolic United Brethren, or the Zion Corporation, bought a square mile up on the east side of the valley. And so one of the guys that served under me in Vietnam lives up there, and he built his house there. He has only one wife, but he's got 14 kids. But anyway, you can't own the land, but you own the house on top of it. It's kind of like a state lease. But polygamy is going away because, for one thing, you have to marry a girl that has become a member. Well, you don't get many Gentiles that'll come in and live in that situation, and kids are still born 50-50.
So Pinesdale is unique in Montana, or are there other Pinesdale-like colonies?
There's
around the
other
state?
colonies too. Jeff's has a colony just across the border in British Columbia, which has caused
But
some
no, I
problems.
mean in Montana.
No, there's no other polygamy colony.
Okay, what about Mormons themselves? Are the steakhouses spreading? Do most?
Yeah, I think they
places?
grow steadily all the time. I don't think they're growing as fast as evangelical congregations.
Okay.
Those are the type that seem to be growing, and our type, the Lutherans, Methodists, even the Catholics, are having trouble maintaining membership, and a lot of gray hair when you go to the services.
Let me ask about conservation. I know you've been really active in that, particularly in land conservation. Is that continue? Clearly in the 70s, people began to talk a lot about it. We did that with the Institute of the Rockies. What's going on now? Is it a huge issue in the legislature and among county commissioners, or is
It's
it
kind
a
of
thing of the past?
Interesting in the sense that I'm on the board of the Montana Land Reliance. I've been on it since it started. This is a nonprofit, private nonprofit, which puts conservation easements on land as landowners approach us and they want to do that to preserve the land the way it was. We reach our 1 million acres. We're at 1 million acres right now.
And that's all private land.
All private land. The Elk Foundation has probably twice that, but it's over a number of states. And then, of course, the Nature Conservancy is strong. And what we've tried to do with the Land Alliance is to foster local land trusts. So we help form, again, starting with RC&D, and then the Bitterroot Land Trust, which has several thousand acres now, and also passed a $10 million bond issue to help the farmer cost share what he's giving up in terms of development rights. And so those programs seem to be going ahead. It's a pretty steady increase. You have areas like the Madison Valley, which between all the different state, federal, Elk Foundation, and some of the others, that most of the valley is preserved as ranch land.
Okay, so the
And
conservation movement is continuing.
It's strong.
And
And it continues to be strong.
And that's across partisan bound. Both Democrats
Yeah.
and Republicans are supportive
Yeah.
of that.
I think so, because now our county commissioners have been very supportive of conservation and willing to spend out of that $10 million bond issue to make it possible for somebody that wants to preserve the old homestead, several hundred acres, and they'll be giving up a lot of potential income, and this way they can make it work.
So the Land Reliance has about 1 million acres. Could you estimate, off the top of your head, the total private land that has conservation easements on it?
Well, I've got a map over that shows, I would say of the private land in Montana, we're probably approaching somewhere between 5 and 10% of all land
That's
is
private,
under
okay.
conservation easement. And that will probably continue. We have, because of the Five Valleys in Missoula, Flathead Land Trust, Bitterroot Land Trust, the land trusts at Helena and Bozeman and so on, we've kind of shifted eastward. But then you get into somebody who come in, like Max Baucus's family came in 60,000 acres in one chunk. And you go to eastern Montana, 3, 5, 10,000 acres at a time. Not that there probably would ever be development, but what those landowners started to look at was almost nobody owns the mineral rights underneath them. And this way, if it's federally owned or Shell Oil or somebody owns the mineral rights under your ranch, if you got a conservation easement, you got a lot stronger
By definition, the
bargaining
private
point.
lands that are in conservation easement, the mineral rights are part of that conservation easement?
Well, we have what we call a mineral remoteness test. And if there's a question about, in most places, who owns the mineral rights. If it's uncertain, we try to get that settled. I'm not sure who owns the mineral rights under my place here. I presume it's Anaconda Company. But since we have no minerals worth having, doesn't matter. However, with the shale drilling and even gravel pits, all of a sudden you can have a place that has a conservation easement and it said no extraction of any kind, and then somebody comes along and tries to break into that for the gravel. And the surface owner may not have much to say about it unless they got an easement.
Would it be your guess that most people in the state are really not aware, pretty much ignorant of their mineral rights?
Yeah, I'm sure they are.
Water rights are more common.
Yeah.
We're aware of that. But mineral rights are more a mystery.
Yeah, and you can look it up fairly quickly, of course.
The reason I raise that's a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And an outfit like Nestle wants to literally buy up all the private water in the world.
Yeah.
And
Bottle
that's their
it.
goal. And they're huge in Africa and buying up the whole nation, private access to fresh water.
Yeah.
There are other corporations competing. So the question becomes, in a place like Montana, which is in some ways like Australia, in a sense it's innocent about this corporate demand on a variety of natural resources, including air, as well as water. And so I'm just interesting to me is how much people are aware of the need for a defensive posture, I guess you would. And you can view the conservation easements as a defensive posture.
And that was the idea.
But do we have counterparts around the state for mineral rights or for water? I assume the latter, but again, you're in a position to know more than most people about that. And does that appear in the state legislature in the last session, any of those issues?
Well, the one that would have come up again but wasn't acted upon would be the Indian water rights thing, which is centered around Lake County, but which could in effect any place where natives have ever fished or hunted. And all of a sudden that got all the irrigators upset because they said, well, what about the Bitterroot? Yeah, they could come up here and claim the water. And then, of course, you have the water claims by Bonneville Power and the old Montana Power that passed on to Northwest Energy and so on like that. The water situation is very complicated and it's still being worked on. But in our case here, our irrigation water, we're under the Big Ditch, which irrigates 18,000 acres out of Lake Como. And they have taken care of making sure that my right is a part of their whole picture. Our well drilling, on the other hand, they came out with another one saying, well, you got to register your well. Well, I think mine is old enough that it's okay. But there's a big flap up at Kalispell right now. Some outfit wants to come in and I figured how many thousand gallons an hour to bottle water, and the neighbors all around, it's not a big place, 10, 20 acres, all the neighbors see themselves losing their wells. And I don't know how that'll settle out right now. It's a court case.
A hot issue.
Yeah.
See.
So the air might be another one. What about airspace overhead? Because there are places where there are air rights, in fact.
Yeah. Well, as a Missoulian, I grew up with an air problem, with a pollution problem from the teepee burners.
Yeah.
And then when paper making became central and a big taxpayer in the county, the argument was, well, you smell that awful odor coming from the paper mill, but that's just greenbacks, that's money.
Yeah, and it was important at the time. And you look at Butte Anaconda, how much was killed. Have you noticed how the trees have come back since the smelter went down?
Well, I wanted to finish my point, which is Missoula now is viewed as a beautiful place. And the measure of that, empirically, is the increasing amount of money that comes in for investment, over $1 billion in downtown development in the coming couple of years, and equal that or more in the county. to the point that for the city, much of the county, other than the mountains and the distant parts, are potentially urban and suburban, all tied into the same sewer system, the same water system, the same fire system, and the same school system. And while people are fighting that, increasingly their voice is drowned out. Well, that's a global phenomenon. It isn't just peculiar to Missoula. And I'm sure growth towns like Billings are experiencing that. But again, from a distance, it's hard to know how much aware they are of the benefits to the 21st century information society, in which people want to live in beautiful places that are devoid of bad air and bad water, which helps explain this huge investment coming into the Flathead in Missoula. So my question is, does the legislature aware of that and the change from agriculture as the dominant economic base to what used to be tourism, but you could conflate that with the information industry?
Well, if you're to link tourism with the ability to work on distant sites from your own home and this sort of thing, we're seeing that here. That it's astounding the number of people who have a computer in their bedroom, and they're all, like the lady across the road. I mean, her. Let's see, what does her sister do? Is it which makeup and is she?
No, it's the one that they get the pink Cadillac.
They get the pink Cadillac, yeah. Anyway, and so she works from home, and we have a lot of people like that. The other thing, which is, and we work on this a lot with the Economic Development Authority, is these small enterprises. I am amazed at the number of things that are produced in garages and basements in this county, and I'm sure it's the same in Missoula. And for instance, we have in the last few years, well, it's taken a while, but Cooper Firearms right along the highway where the log home place used to be, there's 50 to 60 guys there making high-end, they started out varmint rifles for shooting prairie dogs and coyotes, now up to 375 Holland to Holland, elephant guns. And these are $2,500 to $5,000 guns each, and they can't keep up with the demand. There's 2 ammunition loading places here. They run 24 hours a day loading ammunition up to 50 caliber. There's a gun barrel place up in Kalispell that can't keep up with the demand. All kinds of different things like that nobody ever thought about. Partially because the kind of people who would be interested in working there also are outdoorsmen. They want to be, the owners might have been in Seattle or California, and they had all kinds of restrictions. Oh, you have guns, you're terrible, and we don't like you. So I moved to Montana, where guns are just another tool that people keep to use when they need it. And we don't, that's another thing, get the whole gun thing. I was looking at something and said, I don't remember how many members there are in the NRA, several million. In the history of the NRA, when it started with the National Guard in 1875, until now, I don't know of a single case where an NRA member has ever been arrested and convicted for misusing a firearm. And yet there's firearms everywhere, and in this state, through safety programs and things like that, there's 1 or 2 kids a year kill each other or kill themselves. They trip over them or something like that. And so here it's not a big deal. And then in other places, of course, Chicago, which has the strongest gun laws in the nation, and there's 12 murders a day, that sort of thing. I don't know what's happening. But it
sounds like NRA propaganda to me.
Yeah.
My question about what you told me about the gun manufacturing places is interesting. Do you think that the buyers, the people who are customers, are generally aligned with the Bundys and the kind of pseudo-patriotic stuff we got at Malheur Refuge last
No,
year?
these people are more professional, just long distance target shooting is a big thing, and
In Montana itself.
carefully done under controlled range conditions. You know, you're shooting 1,000
But I'm
yards.
talking about the customers for this new gun.
Yeah, and of course, people
know
like that
anything?
they are going to spend.
I assume it's a
Three-
national
yeah.
base.
3,000. Yeah, it's a national market. You aren't going to spend $3,000 for 2506 with a beautiful stock on it and all that to go out and do bad things. You go out to the rifle range once in a while.
But there are not many Montanans can afford that.
No, and a lot of that. The interesting sidelight that's coming in, and I realize people aren't, is the amount of weapons that are being manufactured with in home shops. You can get an upper and a lower for an M16 now, and it's called an 80%. All you have to have is a drill press, and you put it in a jig, and you drill the holes and put it together. And they aren't full automatic; they're semi-automatic. And then the precise parts you just buy, and the aluminum parts you just drill, and then you snap them together, and you got a 223, same as an M16. So there was, of course, during Obama's time, a great rush to buy guns. It's slowed down now because people are figure, well, Trump isn't going to take guns away. That's a whole thing. When you compare us with Canada, why the difference? And I'm not sure, because Canadians need and use guns as much as anybody. They got bears and moose and need to collect deer once in a while and so on like that. But the unfortunate part is that so far as gun crime is concerned, it's very, very low impact here in Montana. It's very rare. Knives.
I don't
show
know
up
anything
mo-
about the crime statistics in Montana. Do you think nationally there's been a steady reduction
Yeah.
in the percentage of burglaries, of murders, of violent crimes, except in select areas like Chicago? But Montana, are you aware one way or the other of how the...
I think it goes down also. I don't have the latest statistics or anything like that. There
It's
is
not an issue the county commissioners are...
No, they're not worried about this.
Okay.
County commissioners are worried. Well, one thing we're working more and more on, again, is to be ready for emergencies, whether it was floods like happened when we got rain. I mean, we're not used to having rain. We get an inch of rain and it just washes us away. And there was flooding here, and of course road damage, and that goes to the road department, and the commissioners end up paying the bill for that. And the fires. And the fire is the big thing here that we have to worry about. As I point out that with the forests, I know there are people that say, well, I don't want to clean up around my place, I want it to be natural. And I says, Mother Nature has a way of dealing with that. Every 80 years, it just burns all up. So I said, you want to be natural, but you may not like the results. And that's what happened to people that refused to clean up. Of course, they lost everything, including their homes. And so trying to have precautions to be prepared for emergencies. The other thing which we see here, and of course probably throughout the state, Missoula is kind of a center for this, is that the infrastructure for medical care and so on continues to grow, continues to get more expensive. But after having that stent put in 6 weeks ago, right through my wrist, I think, boy, I sure like this system. When I got the pains, I was down there in no time, and they just took care of it in no time.
Really?
And that's, of course, the biggest employer in this county is healthcare, including for the senior citizens. It's like 2,000
So is that,
people.
would you say, as public issues go, is that number one?
Well, it would be, if
equal
anything gets
education?
shifted, it will be, because there are areas in eastern Montana, central Montana, where you don't get that kind of care, or it's 80 miles away. And the helicopter ride is $30,000. And unless there's a government program to cover it, the average person can't do it. So
So would you rank it with education as the two most common issues?
probably, yeah. Education will continue to be important. We see a little progress in some areas, and then others, like the University of Montana, a question about why has the enrollment dropped so. Well, there's a number of different reasons. One is you move toward math and engineering, that defers over to Bozeman. And our granddaughter's taking the nursing program at the university, and which is among the highest rated in the nation. So also we got the Bitterroot College established here in Hamilton, and that leads to an associate's degree. And then you have other programs like Job Corps, which 98% of the kids that train for a trade at Job Corps are hired before they
Job Corps
leave.
is still large, 80% federal money, or
Yeah, it's all federal money.
is there any grants? Do
no.
rich people put money into it?
It's totally under Department of Labor,
Okay.
and there's 2 Forest Service centers in Montana. Anaconda, which has all the usual trades: electrician, carpentry, plumbing, welding, office management, and heavy equipment, which is really popular. Here at Trapper Creek, which is the old CCC camp up the West Fork, they have those plus medical office. And what they do at medical office is it's mostly girls, there's some boys. The second year, they place them at the hospital or at a doctor for 6 or 8 months of internships. And so there's really popular.
On the national scene, there's as you know, a controversy about Betsy DeVos and her interest in private schooling, both religious and otherwise, and
Yeah.
vouchers coming from tax-based systems to be used in private schools. Is that popular Upper Valley? They want that? Or
I don't know that most people pay much attention to it, but it could be. There are, of course, you have private Christian schools in Missoula. There's a one outside of Hamilton that goes up to the 8th grade, and then our church has a preschool through 1st grade, which is very popular. People pay for it. There are ways they can get scholarships, and there is also some state support for aid to dependent children kind of things.
So that's state taxes.
Yeah, that
not yet
it
part
is
of it.
used there. And so...
Would you say
and-
generally are people predisposed to modifying our public school system to have it more dominated by private sector?
Well, the way it has worked here, we have, for instance, a lot of homeschoolers. What the established schools do is if they want to participate in sports or band or special things like shop, a homeschool kid can come in and take those courses. Okay. So there's a cooperation between homeschoolers, private schools, the Christian schools, and the public schools. They don't discriminate.
But no homeschoolers can get vouchers yet.
No.
Would
I
that
don't-
be popular if it was?
Oh, I suppose it would be. Although the people that do that also tend to not want to have Uncle Sam handing them anything, even they probably are getting it. But and a lot of the homeschoolers, there's various reasons, and we've had a couple of grandkids. You could say that the high school scene was detrimental enough to them that they didn't quite fit in, or they felt they were left out, or they were rather introverted, and so homeschooling allowed them to get all the education without having to deal with bullies in the hallway.
Right.
And that's here. And then there are some that they don't want to hear anything about modern science or anything like that. There's still a pretty strong, like Gianforte, for instance, he quit talking about it, but he believes the Earth was formed 6,000 years ago, and that dinosaurs and humans ran together, and he supported that museum over at Glendive, which is like the one in Kentucky, the Noah's Ark thing, that everything started 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve.
I didn't realize Glendive had transformed into one. I mean,
Yeah, they got a place there. It's near Makoshika.
Does he have, just as a personal, does he have a problem with the museum in Bozeman? I mean,
He shut up about all of that stuff because when people started asking, They say, would you really believe that the universe was created 6,000 years ago? He says, I wasn't around, so I can't answer that. So, but yeah, it's surprising the number of people we know that believe that, yeah, that all this stuff about millions of years worth of rocks and dinosaurs and that sort of thing, that's hooey. It all started 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve.
Do you think that attitude is more exaggerated now than it was when you first moved to Montana?
Yeah, I'd never heard about it until it's the last 20 years that we started hearing about it, that, people were, well, especially when the dinosaur discovery, so they were trying to say, and I remember one person saying, well, we know that there was a great flood that covered the whole earth because they found seashells way up on the tops of the mountains, not understanding that those were the bottom of the sea and took 40 years to form and got heaved up to become mountains. You're probably running out of time by the...
that are parallel, just my own opinion about, like the NRA, that it's a...